And we very happy to introduce our today's key speaker, Dr. Professor Gregory Delaplace, specialist in anthropology, Mongolian studies, and Asian studies, and our very good colleague. So, Gregory, please take the floor.
Thank you very much. Well, I'll try sharing my screen in order to show some pictures. I wasn't sure I would, but you all showed such nice pictures that I thought I would as well. Not all are directly relevant to what I'm going to talk about. Some are illustrations, but in this lecture, I would like to argue that Mongolian people have come to develop a particular talent for the invisible, a talent that is also a concern for invisible things. What do I mean by concern? I mean both an interest, a care, and a worry. And I hope this will be unpacked as the lecture proceeds. What do I mean by invisible things? Well, I mean two things. I mean, first, these entities that are recognized by Mongolians themselves as invisible, but I mean also things that can be described as invisible from an anthropological standpoint. So the purpose of this lecture will be twofold. First, I will try to outline some aspects of a pragmatics of the invisible in Mongolia. By pragmatics, I mean nothing much fancier than just an attention to relational and discursive settings. At the limit, you could say, I mean, it kind of relates to what Michel Foucault has called an apparatus. And I will use this term. But really, it's something that it's also something that it's also rather close to what Michael Hausmann and Carlos Evry have proposed in relation to ritual. Well, we can come back to that in the questions, but basically what I want to describe is what the question I want to ask is what kind of relational and discursive settings, what kind of apparatuses are put into place or set in motion to tackle the invisible in Mongolia. Of course, I will be able to only mention a few examples of these apparatuses, but I will try to emphasize a few possibilities of mediation, animal, human, and artifactual mediations. And on this basis, I will try to show that the relational and discursive settings talk to a concern for dwelling in places that relates to what I'm going to call an ethics of dwelling with the invisible. So that's basically what I'm going to talk about. But the second purpose, somehow more incidentally, the purpose of this lecture is to reflect once more on the anthropological concept of the invisible. This notion of invisible is often used by anthropologists and other social scientists, but it's never really questioned. The other questions, and I want to ask more theoretically, is to what semantic conditions is the notion of invisible anthropologically relevant and interesting? And the answer I would like to test here is that this condition is that this notion is neither too narrow nor too broad. So the realization that I hope will emerge from this lecture is that an anthropological concept of the invisible is useful, is fit for comparison on two conditions. On the condition that it does not only translate what Mongolian people describe as invisible things. If this concept can have some comparative traction, it should draw on what Mongolian people themselves think as being invisible. But on this basis, it should open a field of comparison that may talk to the invisible as a broader human phenomenon and reality. So the first condition is that it's not too narrow, that it doesn't just reiterate what Mongolian people consider invisible, but it's the first condition for the anthropological fitness of this concept is that it's a bit broader than that. But the other condition is the opposite, that it's not too broad, because if the invisible if the invisible is to retain some comparative relevance, it must not be too diluted. It must be specific enough in order to let us grasp a certain and a coherent range of phenomena. So if the invisible, on the opposite, on the contrary, stands for anything that cannot be seen, then it's not a very useful notion either. So the first basis on which I will attempt to define this concept is the starting point is the notion of apparition. So the invisible, first approximation, the invisible, the working definition of the invisible is something that appears by virtue of a specific apparatus. And it's these apparatus that I will try to describe here. So let me start this lecture really after this introduction. So let's start with one of the most basic, perhaps the most iconic of these apparatuses in Mongolia, the assemblage between a rider and his horse. I will talk mostly of male relationship to the invisible in this lecture. It's of course a bias of my own gender as a field worker. Being a man, I'm mostly hanging out with men, and I have been biased to study male relationship to the invisible. But we can talk about gender a bit more, and I will tackle again this question now and again. The horses in Mongolia are known to feel the invisible. How do I know it? Well, because there are stories about this. And what is interesting is that horses react with different behaviors according to the proximity of the invisible thing. So Uno Arvar and Antoine Mostart have described ritual apparatuses where horses are used to confirm that a soul has left or reintegrated the person who is sick or dying. So the horse, in these ritual apparatuses, the horse is supposed to shiver when the soul passes it. Then I have collected also a story in northwestern Mongolia, in Ufs Aimak, where I've been doing some field work for now somehow 20 years or so. So this story goes like that. There's someone's dad who goes marmot hunting, and he finds a refuge that he knows well. He ties his horse next to the refuge, and it's evening, so he lights a fire to make tea and to warm himself up. He feels lonely. He would like some company. It's unusual to go hunting alone. Circumstances happen that he has to go hunting alone. So he hears actually some people coming. He hears the sound of their voices and the sound of the hooves of their horses. And the storyteller, a woman actually, the storyteller says that he hears a dongur dongur of their speech, a language that he doesn't recognize, and the towur towur of the hooves of the horses. So he's happy, but the voices, they never really they seem to be approaching, but no one comes up. And then there is this other thing that the horse is really agitated. So the horse is jumpy. The horse shivers, and even the horse is neighing. So then he starts to be really worried, and he understands what these presences are. Actually, they are not human, they are ghosts. So he goes in his refuge, and the storyteller says quite laughingly, because it ended well, she says quite laughingly that he spends the night clasping his rifle in fright, because he knows that the ghosts are around, and the horse all night long is neighing, is kicking around the refuge, and he spends a sleepless night just listening to his horse being agitated. So, and this is how the story finishes. On the morning he leaves, and he knows that the place is haunted. So what is interesting here is the variability of the horse's reaction. So horses, they shiver when the invisible things passes, the invisible things pass them by. But they get jumpy and they neigh when the thing approaches. They kick when the invisible thing is nearby. So it seems as if the body of the horse is itself sensitive to the invisible things. And it seems also that the body of the horse absorbs the invisible presence. And it seems as if the stories that I told finished well, because the horse was there to somehow protect and shield the owner of the horse who was sleeping in the refuge. So this also says something of the way spirits and invisible things are conceived of in rural Mongolia. So there are many kinds of spirits that are known to Mongolian people, with lots of words that we can come back to in the discussion, but Razeniedzet, Savdak, Lufs, some of these terms have, of course, Tibetan origin, but they are collectively called invisible things. And these things, they, what we can see from how horses react to this, these things, they are thought in a comparison to currents, almost electric currents that are supposed to circulate in given areas. And this is actually how they're called in Mongolian. They're ghosts. One of the words for ghost is gudel. So gudel, which translates also as current, and which could be applied to electric currents. It's not how electricity is called customary, but gudel could make sense as an electric current. But this idea that they are akin to electric currents is also consistent with the way they are treated during rituals. I told you about these rituals where horses are involved to detect whether a soul is reintegrating a body when calling the soul for a sick person. Uno Arva has described such a ritual. Or to just before funerals, when people want to make sure that the soul, on the contrary, leaves the body. So there is a ritual described among the orders by Antoine Mostard, which is called pulling the soul. And both these rituals feature not only horses, but a string. So a string that is attached from somewhere near the sick or the dying or dead person and the horse, as if the soul would travel along a string or wire, exactly like electricity. And third thing, it's interesting that electricity itself is supposed to undermine spirits. So it's quite often that you hear, that I heard in Ouf's IMAC, that before there were much more many more spirits, and spirits were much more present in the area. But since there was electricity in the region, since there were electricity lines, actually the ghosts disappeared, or their presence was much less felt. So in all areas where there is electricity, there is less ghosts, as if these two phenomena were competing, as if they were kind of the same phenomena, but in two different instances. So horses are some kind of detectors. You could say even if spirits are thought in relation to electricity, the horses are some kind of magnetometers, these devices that are used to measure magnetism. So this is very handy to anticipate the location of these currents or these fields that no one can really locate permanently because they're moving. It's not just one place that is haunted. It's these currents are circulating. So you can never really know where they are unless you have this detector. And this is why horses are so important. So, of course, there are some places where spirits are known to reside. So mountaintops, for example, or ovo, this cairn that are expected to concentrate spirit presences by virtue of amassing things. Ovo, cairn are basically heaps, and this is what ovo means in Mongolian. It means a heap. There are heaps of things, and by virtue of being heap, they also concentrate the presence of spirits. But they are not only there, the spirits and ghosts. And in general, Mongolian cosmos is thought of being in constant flux. And and you can never really know where things are for at a given moment. The dwelt environment in Mongolia is teeming with presences that are impossible to pin down for an extended period of time. Of course, pinning down presences is what the various Buddhist institutions have tried to do when they disseminated throughout the country at various points in Mongolian history. Most of all, the Gelugpa clergy that has had the longest and most popular success among the Mongols since 16th century at least. They succeeded partially only. At the most concrete and basic level, this impossibility to anticipate invisible presences is problematic, because encountering these things inadvertently is supposed to cause a shock, which may result in the person's soul leaving the body, hence the need to call it back sometimes. This is mostly the case with ghosts, ghosts which are called suns or chudgur, gudel, guts, but you don't really know what these presences are. So often in stories are collected, people don't really try to identify precisely what the invisible presence is. When you encounter such a presence in the open, in the steppe or in mountains, your main purpose will be to avoid it. And maybe a specialist can go there and try to deal with this presence later. But people, when they encounter these presences, they don't really try to discern whether it's a ghost or it's a demon or it's a landmaster. They will try mostly to avoid it as an invisible thing, because meeting with these things is not only unpropitious, but it's dangerous for one's life, as it prompts the soul to leave the body. But this is very difficult to anticipate and to avoid these things. So unless you have a horse with you, it's difficult to know what is where, basically. Interestingly, and I want to emphasize this point, it's not any horse that is sentenced to invisible things. It's only saddled horses. It's a detail that is always specified by people who tell this kind of stories, or even by Unuava or Antoine Mostart, who recounts a ritual where horses are involved to this end. The horse is not always mounted, like on the picture, but it's always saddled. And it's not considered a detail in Mongolia, because there are actually two different words to call a horse, depending on whether it is roaming free or saddled in order to become a mount. The first word is ado, the second is mer. And when you confuse it, when the anthropologist, the ethnographer will call the horse you're seeing on the photograph, if you say that this person is riding a adu, people will look at you as if you were mistaking a goat for a sheep. I mean, no, of course, this is mer, this is not adu, as if they were almost two different animals, you know. So it is only mer, the mounted horse, saddled horse at least, which are expected to feel the presence of the invisible. And one of the contexts in which saddled horses, mer, are used to detect the presence of invisible things is funerals. Choosing the site to lay down the body of deceased parents is a delicate matter in Mongolia. Getting it wrong, that is buru shola, wrongly installing a body, is a sure way of preventing the soul of the deceased to be reborn. It is a promise of ghosts springing up from the graveside to haunt their relatives. So not one, but two specialists are involved in picking a site and taking it, Gazarvar in Mongolian. The first specialist is a diviner who directs the family on the various constitutive elements of the funeral, among others, the type of burial. So that is Should the body be buried under the ground, in the ground? Should it be laid out? Should it be cremated? All these options are theoretically available in Mongolia. But also, the diviner chooses, instructs the family on the direction towards which the dead had to be taken out. So he will say, for example, well, in order to bury the dead, to lay out the corpse, it should go out of the gap from the eastward, right, or westward, on north or south, right? But that's all the instructions that they will give. They will not provide any further detail on the actual place where the dead person has to be laid out or installed, buried. There is, for this, a second specialist who is also a diviner. Who is also a diviner, but a less institutionalized one. While the first is often a lam, that is a Buddhist monk in a monastery, and usually there are specific monks in monasteries who are able to do this kind of divination, which is called opening the golden vessel. But the second one is more of a local specialist, the kind of specialist that is known as a skillful person, melgenkun. It is important that this person is local because he needs to know the precise features of the land where the body is going to be taken out, because he will have to pick up the exact spot where the body is going to be installed, and this is done through divinatory means, of course. But whereas the first monastery diviner relies on mathematical calculation and manuals that involve the charting of planets, of elements, and a lot of other variables that have to be combined, the second specialist needs to draw on more embodied knowledge of astrology. So there are also lots of criteria that come into account, like the sign of the deceased, of course, there's a year sign, but also the position of the river, of overs, of springs, of camps, of pastures, lots of invisible components of the place, which the specialist has to take into account. And this is why the diviner is considered skillful, melgen. The particular talent of being melgen is to know how to assemble and associate the intensely heterogeneous cosmos that people need to navigate on a daily basis. And this cosmos is made of visible and invisible components, but the diviner, the skillful person, is the one who is trusted to be able to come up with an efficient and efficacious gesture, a correct procedure, a correct procedure that will combine and associate rightfully these different components of the cosmos. And to do this, there is actually a third actor who is involved, not only these two, the third actor in the choice of a place to bury the dead. And this third actor is, as I hinted already, is a horse. Charles Bowden and others, they have described how the party that sets out to choose a gravesite the day before the actual funeral will eventually let the horse pick the exact spot. That is, when the local diviner, the skilled person, has narrowed down the search to a particular place, he will let the horses go and actually take the exact spot where a horse has started to pee. The reason why a peeing horse is considered a proper judge of the rightful burial place is never really explained. But after what we've said, it's not hard to understand. If indeed horses become more and more agitated as they get closer to invisible things, then the moment they choose to pee is a sign of pure relaxation. And therefore, the certainty that laying a dead person there will not disturb any other entity. It's if the horse is a detector, then a peeing horse is a neglectable measure. It's a negative result. There is no invisible thing if the horse is relaxed enough to pee, because, as you know, and as Mongolian people surely know, horses can defecate while running away. But if they choose to pee, they cannot move. So they must be perfectly relaxed and perfectly certain about their environment. So it's a very striking ethnographic detail that shows two things, at least, I think. First, the talent that Mongolian people display towards these things that not everyone can see. They don't just rely on other beings, they craft human-animal assemblages to make themselves and their horses capable of things that none of them can do alone. It means that the horse is a saddle horse. That means that a horse without a human is not deemed to be able to perceive the invisible. And the human without the horse is not able to do that either. It's a conjunction, the assemblage of the horse and the human, that becomes a sentient thing. Second, this shows that the talent for the invisible stems from a concern, so a care and a worry. The choosing of a gravesite is illustrative of a general care that Mongolian people tend to take in important occasions of their lives, at least, to make appropriate combinations between the heterogeneous elements of the cosmos. That's, of course, the whole point of divination, the system of sorting out the cosmos efficaciously that they've been borrowing from Chinese and Tibetan inspiration since at least the 13th century at various levels of their society. Mongolians have a particular way of associating fortune, prosperity, appropriateness in general to the performance of a rightful gesture of procedure. The concern for the invisible components of their environment often takes the form of a care to make the right choices, get out of their home in the right direction, wear particular colors, avoid particular elements of their environments, etc. Paradoxically, though, Mongolian people have a way of not always caring for the right gesture or procedure, and they do not always rely on divination to guide their gestures. Most of the time, they rely on another invisible thing, a personal strength or luck. I like to call it serendipity, called himor. And it's actually a translation of the Tibetan Lungta. And this himor, this personal ability, this personal mojo, you could say, ensures that things will actually organize themselves, fall into place around you and for your own benefit. So maintaining your level of himor depends not really on the proper combination of heterogeneous things, but more on the respect of hierarchies. I can't really dwell on this point, but we can come back there. So in order to maintain your level of himor, you have to respect hierarchies, which is not as simple as it looks, and you must steer out of pollution. So the balancing of skill and force, so being mergen and having himor, using divination and relying on your mojo, is quite pervasive in Mongolia and throughout activities that people do on a daily basis. So most people resorting to religious specialists in Ulaanbaatar or anywhere nowadays will either request advice on the right choice to make. Will this activity suit me? Will this apartment be okay? Will this partner be a good match for me? Will this particular set of things be a proper combination? So that's doing the right force, being skillful in your life. Or they will ask pollution to be removed from them in order, so Ayurveda, the purification, in order for the himor to be restored. So pollution, as anybody who's spent some time in Ulaanbaatar, pollution is deemed unavoidable in cities nowadays. most of all when doing business, because of the harmful effects of malicious gossip, which springs from envy or indeed from the mere concentration in one place of contradictory and potentially clashing ambitions. But just to say that this concern for the invisible, and I'll come back on this later, is not only a matter of rural areas, it's also pervasive in cities. But yes, it's often a balancing between skill and force. You either request some mediation of specialists in order to be advised on the right choice to make, or you ask specialists to help you restore the humor that helps you navigate the cosmos without making a blunder, because the cosmos will organize itself around you thanks to this humor. So what I would like to emphasize here before coming back in conclusion to the situation in cities is that funerals and the gravesites are used in Mongolia as a platform, a site to perform the particular concern or talent that Mongolian people cultivate throughout their life. The grave is indeed one of the only occasions when people can hope to position themselves perfectly within the cosmos. They can be perfectly skillful with the grave. Graves are a rare promise of absolute astrological control. Most of the time during one's life, astrology is a bit of an approximate business. There are so many variables to be taken into account that there is a good chance one will make a mistake or cause a cosmological mismatch. I don't have time now to tell this personal anecdote when I consulted myself a specialist after I had run into some small troubles, and I had reasons to think that my humor was down and that my relationship to things were out of sync. So I consulted a specialist, and actually the reason why I was somehow out of sync with my environment was because I had received a yellow container, Sharsab. That could be anything. And how was I supposed to know that I had to avoid a yellow container from someone who had given it to me? It's impossible, and that's the point. You can never anticipate all the variables through which you are going to go, and you can never anticipate the mismatch that you are going to incur. People do try to anticipate them. So each year, after Tsansar, you go and do a Dasar, a ritual that in which you will be instructed of the things that you need to avoid, the things that you need to do in this during this year, and what you can count on, what you will have to be careful about. And even when you enter a new job, you will do that. You may go to a diviner, Durhech, or other specialists. Actually, you can go to a shaman now in Ulaanbaatar. He will do the same, or she will do the same. They will warn you against specific people, specific elements, specific items that could be harmful for you. So you try to anticipate, but you never can anticipate anything, everything. So you will always run into unexpected things. And one of the best examples of this is, again, in funerals. The person, the specialist, the diviner who opens the golden vessel, who will do the funerary divination, will reveal the cause, the problem that provoked, that caused the death directly. And often it's an anecdotic thing. You know, it's not carelessness that prompts this kind of astrological mismatch. It's just the way the cosmos is. The cosmos is too intensely heterogeneous to be able to anticipate completely how you will be able to propitiously navigate in it. And nobody expects actually to get it right. Everybody expects to have to consult specialists in order to retrospectively pin down what mistake they made and how to repair it. But my point is that a grave is actually the possibility to produce a ritual response to a complex astrological situation that is more or less fail-safe. So choosing a grave means choosing the type of grave, and there is a multiplicity of options that I hinted at previously. Burying in the ground, laying on the ground, cremating, and Alexei Poznayev in the 19th century tells of even other possibilities linked with water, linked with wood, with all elements. And this is decided astrologically. And both the choice of, the point of having all these options is that there will be one that is actually fitting for you, and exactly fitting. It means that it won't be an approximation. It won't be something that you will try to anticipate and not be sure whether this is right or not. It will be exactly right. And this is why Mongolian people have liked in their history to cultivate a multiplicity of funerary options. And why the government today is still has still lots of difficulties to unify funerary options, because Mongolian people, on the contrary, they want to keep as many options as possible in order to tailor-make for an option to be tailor-made to each situation. And it's not, of course, only the type of burial, it's also the place and the exact spot, as we've seen. So the grave site is actually the promise of having the exact astrological answer to the cosmological problem that is posed by laying a dead person on the ground. Of course, it's quite complicated still, and Alexei Poznayev, he has a very interesting description of the burial of 11-year-old funerals of an 11-year-old boy. Things are always contradictory. So the planet that is contrary to him is actually going in the direction where he was supposed to go out, so they have to find another solution. But the point is, it's possible. It's possible by a grave to have a perfect astrological response to the heterogeneous conditions of the cosmos at the point. So it's all rather well known, but I would like to insist on something else now, and I will have to speed up a bit in order to stay within the time frame. I would like to insist on something else now in relation to the grave site. It's that the grave site is itself used to implement a particular and a very delicate regime of presence in the homeland that is constitutive of how people are supposed to dwell in places. And this is the point that I'm going to develop now. Dwelling in Mongolia is closely tied up with the notak, the homeland. When I say closely tied up, it's kind of an understatement, because there is a sense in which the definition of notak, homeland, is what you dwell in. And dwelling is precisely what you do in relation to your notak. So the two are completely interlinked, dwelling and notak. Strictly speaking, the notak could be defined as a nomadization unit, roughly. It's a space within which nomads circulate throughout a year, and therefore it is often the space within which one was born. So notak is often synonymous of person notak. So the homeland is the place of birth, the birthplace, the origin. So the place of origin. And geographically, it's usually defined in relation to a mountaintop that is really the core of the notak, and a river that flows from it, that is the axis around which the notak is organized. So even when you actually reside in a city, you may refer to the rural district where you were born or where your parents were born as your notak. And by extension, the notak is the space of the nation. So cities are included in the notak. Anyway, the ethics of dwelling in one's rural notak as a nomad involves a certain statement of invisibility. This is something that has been noted by some ethnographers and travelers, but it's also something that I could witness when doing fieldwork in Kharkira and Turgen mountains in Ufs, in the extreme northwest of Mongolia. You can see a picture of Kharkira Turgen Valley. So this ethics, this statement of invisibility involves not leaving traces of one's occupation of places. So it's most obvious when a camp moves and the trace, they're supposed to leave only the trace of the ger, the round trace that will disappear after a time. And on the center there is the trace of the earth, the fire that will also disappear after some time. But when you take wood for fire, you are supposed to take it in order for the landscape appearance to be unchanged. You are not supposed to move stones around when you circulate in a landscape, or where you live somewhere. And of course, you are supposed not to dig the ground where in the notak. But I mean, it's ambiguous, because once we say that, then we have to account for the fact that Mongolian people appear quite careless in throwing rubbish in the open space. Well, I want to stress that I think that the problem with leaving trace is leaving traces of occupation. It means that leaving rubbish is forbidden when it's actually concentrated in a place of living. Throwing rubbish out on the way is not really a problem, because what is a problem is actually, I think, well, we can discuss this, but what is a problem seems to be claiming ownership over one particular place within the notak. Mongolian people, in their ethics of dwelling, they are very careful not to appear as if they were claiming to be the masters of the place, because they are only spiritual masters to places. It's Gazarietzet, which are deemed to be the masters of places that Mongolians are only circulating through. So, of course, it's different for aristocrats. And back when Mongolia was ruled by an aristocracy that of people who were called also could claim the mastership of particular places, then there was a negotiation between these aristocratic masters and the spiritual masters. But this is another topic. I mean, we can talk more about this. This negotiation is really interesting. But nowadays, there is a care taken to invisibilize, to make the marks of occupation as invisible as possible, in order to do as which they were not occupying any place within the notak. So there is this performance of dwelling that involves the care not to leave too many traces, as if nomads were striving to dwell in the whole of their notak without ever claiming to occupy any particular place within it, as if they were always circulating within the whole of the space without claiming mastery on one particular place within it. So as if they were holding themselves in the whole of the space of the notak. So it begs a question of how to do in cities. And I don't think I will have time to broach this question at the end. Maybe I will say a few words at the end about that. But there is something to be said of this modality of dwelling in the notak, which is called in Mongolian hot, which means city, but which can mean also a more permanent encampment. So hot as cities or as encampments have always been a modality of dwelling in the notak. And it's not something new. It's something that is ever present in the possibilities of dwelling ethically. But my point is that this regime of presence, which living people are striving to achieve during their life, the gravesite achieves once again perfectly. There is an ambiguous visibility of the sign stone as a device. Oh, sorry, this is a skillful person, American film. This is a sign stone. The sign stone is a stone that is laid beside the body when on the day of the funerals. And it's a stone on which offerings of incense are made, both to the dead person, but also to the landmasters around. So there is this ambiguous visibility of the sign stone. As a device, it is a fantastic invention, and it really pinpoints the kind of invisibility that I'm trying to get at here. It's, of course, the gravesite with the sign stone, it allows for the disappearance of the body, which is eaten and scattered, eaten by animals and scattered by elements. It's an interesting performance of human occupation that is overrun by the notak itself, through its animals, wind, meteorological conditions, and so on. So it's really a performance of an occupied space that is overrun and taken out by the notak itself. But it's also a very interesting apparatus of forgetting. That is an apparatus of forgetting that is also actually a landmark. So it's a landmark that is supposed to disappear as such, or to become really ambiguous as to what it signals. Signstone, Temdekchulo in Mongolian, is a very interesting sign. It's not inscribed in any way, and it's recognizable only by people who actually know who was put there. And so it's indexical of the presence of a grave, but very quickly whose grave it is, and even the fact that it was a grave will disappear from visibility. So it is a material thing that is supposed to disappear and appear depending on context and people. And very quickly, I have been witness to many commemoration rituals where on some occasion, you can come back on that, it's quite rare, but on some occasions, people come back on the gravesite of their parents and perform a ritual. It's very difficult to find the signstone. Here you have the signstone of this person's mother, and you can see that pieces of biscuits and donuts have been scattered, and sweets have been scattered on the ground. And so two things are really interesting is that it's very difficult to find the gravesite after for commemoration after a few years. Now it's been like 10 years since this funeral, and 10 years after, it's really difficult to find it. It took hours to find it, to find the exact location. They were not sure which stone it was, although they had themselves made the funeral. I mean, this person was at the funeral, and he was like heading the funeral. But he wasn't really sure which stone it was. And then another thing interesting about this commemoration ritual is that it performs again the disappearance of the body. It's quite striking because people lay these biscuits and then they move. And of course, as soon as they moved, the kites and other birds, but mostly kites, they come and they eat the biscuits in a way as if to re-perform the eating out of the body and the scattering of the remains. So it's really interesting as a material device that allows a performance of dwelling in the notak without actually occupying any place within it. As for divination, it is a rare, perfect instance of what people know they can do imperfectly throughout their life. The grave is a promise to do that perfectly upon death, to actually be exactly, to be installed in a perfect astrological combination, and to disappear and occupy the whole of the notak without standing exactly in one spot. And there is a detail, after which I will really move to the conclusion. There is a detail that I discovered only recently, which really reinforces this point. The ability that the grave gives to dwell in the whole of the notak without standing or staying in any particular point, is that I was really wondering why there weren't more bones, human bones, scattered in the mountains in Khachira and Turgen, because I was doing inquiries on where people had been laid on the ground precisely, and there were places known to people for gathering many dead people. So I never could see any cranium or long bone. I mean, very occasionally, and I was really curious about that because, of course, I could see bones of a large cattle animal or horses. So, and they died on the spot. So why could I see the bones of large animals and not the bones of humans? I was thinking maybe there are double funerals, second funerals. Maybe the bones are picked up afterwards. So a few years ago, I really confronted my friends, and I said, well, you can tell me now if you just if you forgot or if you were unwilling to tell me that there were second funerals. If you pick up the bones afterwards, well, tell me now. You can please enlighten me. And they said, well, no, why would we do that? But I said, well, how come we can't see the bones there? And they said, can you see the bones of sheep and goats? I said, well, no. Well, here you go. If the bones of humans are not present in the mountains, it's because they are picked up by vultures. And vultures, they cannot pick up the large cattle animal, but they can pick up humans as they pick up goats or sheep. So I thought it was fantastic. The grave is an assemblage of human, animal, artifactual agency, artifactual through the sandstone, but there is a collaboration between all these people and things, people, animal, artifacts, in order to ensure that the dead will be not only scattered, but also brought to the top of the mountain and therefore dwell in the whole of the notak from its core without having to stand anywhere. So the grave is a point from which dead people are actually scattered in the whole of the notak and reinstituted in its core. So that's it. I think what is interesting is that the grave also illustrates what I'd like to get at in terms of invisible as a notion. The grave is not invisible as something that nobody can see. The grave is invisible in that it becomes visible only to some people sometimes, and it points to a regime of visibility. And the dead person it represents is not only or not exactly there. This regime of visibility indexes of a regime of presence. The dead is not exactly or not only where the grave stands. So what I think is really interesting is that this invisibility of the grave is at the core of an ethics of relating with invisible things. As an invisible thing, the grave is a perfect response to the difficulty of dwelling in a cosmos made up of intense heterogeneity. And as we've seen with the horse at the beginning of this paper, spirits and other invisible things are currents. So like the dead after funerals, they are not only or not exactly where they are perceived or harnessed to be. They are always circulating within the notak, and therefore they are always a little bit everywhere. So the equivalent to a gravesite is for spirits is an oval. It's a point, sometimes barely visible point, from which you may address spirits. But spirits are not only or not exactly there. Ovals are some kind of terminals, as I was hinting at before. So within this multiplicity of invisible things, there are entities that Mongolian people recognize as invisible, spirits, ghosts, etc., and others that I chose to label as such. So this is the point of the invisible as an anthropological concept. It draws on a vernacular concept and expands it in order to provoke comparison, so to speak. The grave, as an apparatus, deals with things that can be called invisible because they display a regime of visibility that indexes a regime of presence, both of which are, I argued, are the center of an ethics of dwelling with invisible. And I will stop there and leave the part I had on cities and invisible things in cities for questions, if we wish, or for another occasion. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you so much. It's just like a rich lecture and presentation, bringing together a multiplicity, like rich multiplicity of topics and data and ideas. So we could make another conference, I guess, just devoted to this combination of. I have kind of lots of. There are lots of things I would like to discuss in more detail, but I will try to limit myself and to give other people also to ask questions. So just two very brief questions, thoughts, whatever. It really would be very interesting to compare these kind of beliefs and narratives which produced about invisible by males and females, and also how it is indicated in this animal, how to say, indicator of invisible and supernatural. As you said, this kind of central figure for male narratives is a horse, and I also kind of quite often heard about dog, and especially like this particular kind of dogs with 4 eyes or something. Also, I never kind of thought to try to think who mostly presents these narratives, kind of males or females. So it would be interesting, this animal indicator as well. And of course, separate but connected to this social field of this childhood, how children kind of interact and how their beliefs reflect on this visible, invisible, supernatural, and about supernatural itself, and when the invisible turning or make itself to be visible. So there are also quite numerous beliefs, narratives, and rituals where they presented when invisible, supernatural, getting visible. So this also would be quite interesting to discuss, and of course comparison between urban and rural traditions and kind of conditions which also transform this. So thanks a lot, and
thank you very much. Yes, and all the points are great points. I hope I can get more data basically on the oscillation between male and female. I have hopes that doing work in cities will give women a more prominent role in dealing with invisible, because in rural setting, they tend to be confined to the space of the girl, and as such, they are made responsible of the management of burhan and dead parents through the altar and offerings in the altar. So they are responsible for a domestic economy that is a bit less spectacular than the economy, the dangerous economy of dealing with an uncertain cosmos that men have to deal with when they go from place to place and so on. So they have more spectacular stories, and they do have stories. Whereas the domestic economy makes for less spectacular stories or less accessible stories for me as a man. So, but it's really a bias, as I was saying in the beginning, and I think this domestic economy, through the business that is done in cities, is given more importance, because fortune the link between domestic fortune and business fortune is more and more important and more central in people's life. So I hope that the more I'm doing fieldwork, mostly in Hollandrum, in the city in Oofs, where I'm going to do more and more fieldwork, I hope that women can feature more prominently as agents and mediators of invisible things. Children have tried, and I've tried collecting ghost stories from children. It's quite difficult. I think I'm not qualified to do it. It's, I mean, I would need to be a much better, I would need to be a folklorist in order to deal with this proliferation of stories. I'm not equipped intellectually to deal with the proliferation of stories. And children really have that. So I gave up because there was too much material. I couldn't deal with the proliferation of stories that they hear from TV, that they recycle from books and get from here, get from there. And that is rather independent from the kind of stories and the kind of relationship that is cultivated by adults. So children have their own world of the invisible, and it's really fascinating. But I just had to give up. It was too big for me in a way. So I'd love for someone to, I'd love to be able to work with someone who actually can, or to read someone who actually can harness this invisible world of children, which is amazing. And dogs, same. Dogs, I wish I had more stories about dogs as mediators of the invisible. They're obviously linked. And I forgot to say that within the assemblage of the gravesite, they take part, because they, of course, participate to eating out the body, eating up the body of the deceased. So often a deceased person is eaten by their own dog after their death. And I think it's a rather spectacular and beautiful thing in terms of relationship between people and animal in Mongolia, and this ethics of dwelling, because dogs are also the mediators with the outside of the ger, outside of the encampment, and so they feature in the defense of the hotel. I think dogs are also a very important component of encampment when they become more permanent, and when they feature some permanent or semi-permanent components like a sheep pen, an enclosure. And dogs are a fundamental part of this technology of dwelling. And yes, the moments when what you call supernatural, I try to avoid this word, but I know how it makes sense, becomes visible. Yes, I mean, we have in common to have worked on ghost stories, and the moments when people encounter are faced with the apparitions of what is usually invisible. What is interesting is that it always features a mediation as well. So horses, but also different kinds of specialists, once again. And the structure, the narrative structures of an encounter with the invisible derives from the kind of specialist that is involved. In Oofs, when I was doing my investigations, there were actually two kinds of stories that circulated that relied on two kinds of mediation and two kinds of contexts. There were two ways in which a normal person could encounter the invisible. It was either in the home or in the outside. If it was in their home, then they had to call a diviner and to exorcise the presence. And it was usually a suns, that was an individual soul, very well identified, that was featured. And you had to identify it, you had to satisfy it, and for that you had to call a diviner. Or if it was in the outside, then it was the point, as I said during the presentation, was not really to identify it or even to exercise it. It was more so to avoid it. And the stories that feature this kind of encounter in the outside, they feature specialists who are usually not diviners, but seers, who have this ability to see since birth. And they are the one who can see from afar that there is an invisible thing. Nobody knows what they are because they are not diviners, these guys. So, and they will enable the narrator to move away from the invisible thing, usually by tricking the narrator. So what is interesting is that the diviner, he knows and he can, but he doesn't see. Whereas the seer, he sees, but he cannot do anything. So there is a real distribution of roles where two mediators have different abilities that therefore are associated or give rise to two different narrative structures. And of course, it was only in Oufs at that time, because had there been a shaman, then the distribution of roles would be completely different. So this distribution of roles and the possibilities of encountering the invisible change in different places and different times in Mongolian cosmologies and history. And what I described was relevant only for Oufs at a particular time. And it already changed because now there are shamans and there are other specialists that come up. And therefore, the possibilities of mediation in encounters of the invisible will change. Sorry for this long answer.
Thank you very much, and it's really very interesting about distribution of roles. And of course, I would be most happy to share some materials, and probably we could do something with children folklore one day also.
Yeah, I would love to.
Thank you very much, and I will give a possibility other participants to ask questions, please.
There is a question from Dimitri Nosov.
Dimitri, please. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this informative and actually a fantastic lecture and fantastic material, which at least the end of the lecture fits greatly with my material from Kazakevich archive. And I would like to go back to the end of the lecture, to this case of you've described of burial tradition in connection with the cult of sacred land. First of all, thank you very much for this idea and this term, this case of Mergen Humus, who are aware of the way to treat the land properly, because it seems I've told this many times already, that in 1925, in summer 1925, Vladimir Kazakevich was involved in the process of, let's say, administrative process of deriving territories in Khanty and Dornod for the Buryats who moved from Soviet Russia. And he actually faced an interesting case. He was very much aware at the time about when the Khalkha were not providing Buryats proper territories, saying that, proclaiming that they are not aware of how to treat the land. So how to treat the mountains properly, how to treat the Tau properly. And that was enough for authorities from Urga at the time already, Ulaanbaatar, to agree with them. So, and this idea of Mergen Humus exactly fits some lacunes in Kazakevich report, but who was aware of the, about who was aware of proper treating. And that I would like to thank you about this point. And the second point, it's my question. Is it, can we say that in case, for example, of this sacred landscape, sometimes personalized, sometimes not, that there was no need to visualize this exact subject, this exact actant, because anyone within the community was aware of its existence and aware of how to treat it. But the only case you had to visualize it was when you were out of territory. So you can take even the photo of the sacred mountain or of the sacred land, and it actually means you are still connected with the, I don't like this term spirit of the land, but it actually seems that it is very much connected with the burial tradition, because in many, at least at Kazakevich's cases, he always gives us stories, legends about these sacred mountains, and he always says that this mount became sacred because there was a bumba or a burial for a local nobility line. So my question is, can we say that there are different types of this invisibility? For example, for this case with the sacred land, it doesn't have to be visible. It is visible with as a land. It is not even a spirit, but it actually is an actant. And we cannot proclaim any kind of property rules for something more alive than we are even. And in case of like Chudgurs and other spirits, that's okay. So we have to visualize them sometimes. And in case of Tyrants, for example, so it can be Terangs, it can be visualized. It has its visual form. And in case of the sacred land, I don't like this term, the cult of mountains, because it's not always mountains. Mostly the mountain is the place or oval on the mountain, which is expected to be the heart of the sacred land, but not always. Maybe the cult of hierarchs, as this term used to cover the real name of the mountain, for example. But so there are maybe different aspects of this idea of invisibility. And sometimes it is not exactly something invisible and covered in at least visual aspect, but it is very much covered and kept nudes in verb aspect, as we speak, for example, about the sacred mountains and the sacred lands.
Thank you very much. Well, you're raising a lot of points that I wish we had time to really discuss this. If this was a live conference, we could. I mean, if we were both in Moscow, we could discuss it over drinks also after. So I have a feeling that my answer can only be partial, and that maybe I didn't get all that you were saying. But first, thank you for this 1925 vignette of the how to say disagreement between Boreads and Halch over the proper management of land, and Boreads are so interesting in Mongolia as the possibility, or at least this modelization again of dwelling one's notak, because Boreads are always dwelling far from their notak, and it poses a lot of problems that come up through shamans mostly. But I haven't done fieldwork with lots of Boread people, but some Boread shamanic ritual I've seen were featuring this very prominently. The problems that are posed by a group of people who dwell far from their notak, and there is a discrepancy between the place where they dwell and the place they refer to as notak. But yes, from Halch point of view, the conditions in which one can welcome people in order to dwell in a place they don't know, and the problems of not knowing the place when dwelling in it is really well illustrated here. There is an article by Sayana Namsarayeva in Asia recently, where she tells of a big convention of Mongolian people, of Mongol people that were hosted by Boris, I think, in I don't remember if it was in Khenti or in Buryatia, but there were all kinds of problems that were raised in relation to people coming in a place that they don't treat properly, even if they were all supposed to be Buryat Mongols and gathering as Buryat Mongols. There were questions as to how the guests were behaving. That was wrong because they didn't know how to behave properly in this place. So yes, and I think indeed that Megan Kuhn is key in this knowledge of the proper praxis of dwelling somewhere. So yeah, I hope we can talk about that again. The fact that if we imagine a stable community living in a notak where everybody knows where things are and everybody is aware of the right way of behaving, I understood your point as saying that in this case, people don't really need to visualize. The thing is that what divination conveys as a conception of cosmos is that it's all in constant flux. So even diviners, they cannot be sure where things are at any given moment. They need to calculate very precisely. And even the calculations that are complicated because it relies on many clashing criteria. I mean, there is this a manual of astrology that Mostart has translated, and that Bowman has made a monograph about also after. It really shows how there is no straightforward way of reading these manuals, and it's not just a chart that you can apply to any situation. It involves interpretation in order to choose which criteria prevail over the other ones, which means that there is never just one answer as to how to behave in a particular condition. So indeed, you don't need to visualize things, but you need to decide how to navigate. And there are always more than one possibility. And for burial, indeed, it's also the case. There is always more than one possibility, which means that even if you know your place, and even if you are Mergen, well, you will come into problems because you cannot anticipate all the variables. And I have a very sad story of the person that I showed the picture to you. He's the Mergen Kuhn of Chachera. Like, everybody respected him very much, but he ran into a series of troubles that ended up with him being dead because he made a mistake during hunting and he shot the wrong wolf, which was deemed to be a wolf loved by Sabdak. And he should have known. He was a Mergen Kuhn. He should have been aware of the criteria according to which you hunt and the conditions in which you can hunt a species or an animal or not. And he wasn't, because he's a diviner, but he's not a seer. So he couldn't actually see on the spot the reality of the wolves that he was hunting. So he could have divined afterwards and understood what had happened, but on the spot, he couldn't visualize the things he was stepping into. And then his son fell in the mountain because of that, ended up dying. His wife died, he died, and there was a whole, over 10 years, there was a whole string of consequences that really started with this unfortunate event with him, also a Mergen, being unable to see what the reality of his notak was. So that's an issue, and even for burial, the sign stones, they are not comprehensible or identifiable by anyone in the notak. And I did the precise investigation of having people identify things and locate dead people. And there is a very scattered knowledge of where dead people were buried by people throughout the notak. So people know their own dead and know where their own dead have been laid down, but often it's approximate. So I saw during commemoration rituals that people have difficulties finding it again, and then it's very limited. So yeah, the knowledge of places and the ability for people to visualize the regime of presences that stem from these landmarks and features of landscape is very heterogeneous and dispersed, actually. So so yes, so I'm a bit doubtful that there is a context in which everybody will be aware of the conditions in which they dwell, and I'm a bit doubtful that the problems only arrive when people live outside of their landscape. That would be my reservation towards the question. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Maybe one short question. Yes, please, Olga.
Well, thank you very much for your interesting lecture. I have a lot of questions, but of course I ask only one of them. It concerns the first part of your lecture about this narrative about the hunter and his horse. And my question is, how can a person protect himself if he meets this invisible spirit that is hostile? Can he protect, or he just can be afraid? And
it's indeed a very good question. I mean, people don't really know. They couldn't tell me. But people usually have talismans, talim, that they wear on them with Buddhist inscriptions, and this will be some kind of protection. But if you actually encounter a soul or a ghost or any invisible thing, there's nothing you can do. What you can do is riding a horse, and the horse is useful also to protect you. And so it was in the story I said, but the most frequent anecdote is for horses to stop unexpectedly and unexplainably at some point when people are riding. So lots of stories you have, and Alia also collected such stories where you actually ride with your horse, and at some point the horse will stop, as if it was the hoofs, the legs were tied. And when this happens, the only possibility to have the horse go again is to pee between the legs, and it's never explained, but I think the explanation is quite straightforward given what we've seen in the presentation, is that peeing for a horse is a state of absolute relaxation. So it's an act of well behaving with your horse to make it believe that it is peeing itself by peeing between its legs, and then the horse will somehow revert to a state of relaxation because pee will be felt between its legs, and the horse will be able to retrieve its behavior of being relaxed. But well, that's I think a really interesting instance of horse riding and horse taming, to be able to modulate its behavior towards the invisible and so on. But what it shows is that actually the horse, if it stops, it's because it absorbs somehow the shock of the invisible thing. And it's like an electric appliance. When it comes into the wrong voltage or too high voltage, poof, it shuts down. And this is exactly what happens with this horse. It comes in contact with this invisible thing that couldn't be felt before, and poof, it shut down. And the only way to reboot it is to pee between the legs, because it's a kind of safe mode of the horse. So this, I think, shows that horses are not only detectors, but they're also protections towards these things. Otherwise, I have never heard of protection. This is what's scary, actually, because you cannot really anticipate where they are. And when you come in contact, it's too late. So luckily you have a horse or you have a seer next to you that will be able to steer you off. So you will be frightened, but you will not get this shock of encountering this harmful current.
Thank you very much.